Okay, this chapter or this module has two aspects to it. One aspect is about quantitative research, and the other is about qualitative. In general, there is a difference between quantitative research and qualitative, and it's not as much about, well, whether one uses numbers and the other one uses words, because as we saw from the example of the survey where you're filling out strongly agree, etc., those were words, but that was quantitative in that it was ordinal data. So in general, quantitative research means if we're measuring something or investigating something a mile wide and an inch deep, that's generally quantitative. They tend to have large samples that you can make generalizations to a population about those. But the drawback to it is because you're dealing with so many people, you don't get to know a whole lot about them. Qualitative research, on the other hand, is if you measure something an inch wide and a mile deep. And basically, what we're saying is there's not a lot of people that we can talk about, but we know a whole lot about those, the characteristics of those people. You have a document called Quantitative versus Qualitative that looks something like this. Will open up this. And basically, this is a very general overview of the difference between the two. In a quantitative research article, they will state a hypothesis right from the beginning and stick with it. And they're either trying to determine whether or not they can support or refute that hypothesis. There should be an unbiased sample. That means we cannot use, well, we can use convenience samples, but that gets into experimental versus not quasi-experimental research. As I said, we tend to have large samples. There's objective scoring of surveys or instruments or tests or things like that. If you're using an observation, but then observation still has some kind of instrument associated with it, like for example, some teachers are familiar with PDAS. That is an observation, but it's based upon an instrument that's already established. A rubric's the same kind of thing. Generally, there will be a presentation of statistics, inferential statistics, to take the sample and make a generalization to a population. As we said, they can be generalized. Qualitative research tends to be very purposive in the sample. We have someone or something, some kind of characteristic in mind. We have anywhere from one to a small focus group. There are open-ended questions, there's interviews, there's observations with anecdotal notes of those. The interviews will be analyzed in terms of the content analysis of the data. There's a lot of drilling of the information, a lot of understanding of the words and the stories that those words tell us. Now, whether one's right or wrong, there isn't a correct answer to that. I do think that researchers tend to be one or the other. I'm a quantitative researcher. The advantages of one or the drawbacks of another. The advantage of quantitative research is you can make a generalization to a population. The downside of that is you can't know much about them. Qualitative research, you can know a great deal about them, but because you're only dealing with a very small group, you can't really say much beyond that initial group that you're dealing with. Within quantitative research, there's two types. There's quantitative and there's experimental and non-experimental research. Experiments have treatments. For example, you have an experimental group and a control group, and you do something to the experimental group, and then you measure to see if there's a difference. Non-experimental research doesn't. That's surveys or something like that, where you're just trying to determine what conditions exist. It is possible to do a treatment of one group and not do a treatment to a control group and use a survey to measure something. So not all survey research is non-experimental. It depends on whether or not there is a treatment. In an experiment, for example, if you're a classroom teacher and you have one class that's going to try using choice theory, for example, as an instructional strategy, and another class doesn't, that's not really an experiment. That's called a quasi-experiment because there's not random assignment of the participants in those. Because you're using convenience sampling, that falls into something called quasi-experimental research. The experimental research is better, but quasi-experimental research is somewhat acceptable, especially if it's something that can be replicated over and over. We talked a little bit in correlation studies about cause and effect. Um, if we really want to know whether or not something, that one independent variable cause the effect on a dependent variable, then the only way that we can really do that is an experiment. And think about it in terms of medicine. If we were trying to determine whether or not a given medicine has an effect on improving heart health, you have to have an experimental group and a control group. All other things being equal, if it is well designed, and the experimental group and control group look a lot alike, they don't know which one's getting the medicine, which one's getting the placebo. The doctors don't either. That way you can narrow down to say this is what appears to be the cause of the change in the dependent variable. The challenge with social science research is there is so many other variables that you cannot control for, that the things that happen in our lives that you can't control for. Some of the issues that come up with social science research and experiments is the problem with ethics. If something is good for one group of kids and you determine that that independent variable is having an effect, a positive effect, then you do have an obligation to provide that significant change to the control group. There's some things that we cannot arrive at through true experimental research. The example here is, does spanking cause increases level of anger in adulthood? Well, if you're really going to do an experiment, then what you would do is you'd have an experimental group of kids and a control group of kids. And no matter the parents' background of the experimental group, then you would have to have them spank their kids. And you would have to follow them on through adulthood. And the control group, no matter what the kids did, no matter the background of the parents, you'd say, do not spank your kids. And we want to see if there's a difference, whether or not spanking increases anger in adulthood. Well, that's unethical to do that. So the way that we get around something like that is we don't ask it at the front end, we ask adults at the back end. We ask people, A, whether or not they have issues with anger, and B, were you spanked as a child? So there's some things that we just ethically cannot do. The other thing, this is the other one I mentioned a second ago about withholding treatment. If something's good for students and seems to be making a difference, then we have an ethical obligation to provide that treatment to the control group as well. The validity and reliability issues, we've hit on this pretty well through the other discussions that we've had, but basically we need to have valid instruments. We need to have reliable instruments. As we've said before, if it's valid, it is reliable. Whether we're doing observations, surveys, any of that part of it has to be right. Non-random sampling, is it bad? Well, no, it's not. If you have to use convenience sampling, you can make up for it with strong participation rates. Yes, you may have only had a convenience sample of sophomores, college sophomores, but you make up for the fact that they're only college sophomores, and we're trying to find out something about their social habits by making up for it with lots of them. It's been said that we know more about college sophomores and lab rats than we do anything else. It's because they're kind of a captive audience. We have access to them. There's a lot of research that's gone into perceptions of people that's based upon college psychology majors, especially the sophomores who are already in the program. The demographics are important, and this is really critical to being able to evaluate the articles that you look at, because we need to make sure that the sample that we're looking at represents the population that they're trying to make a generalization to, and that they have enough people in their sample to make a generalization to something else. For example, the article about the computer-based instruction. In that article, it talked about significant improvement in reading ability for those who are using computer-based instruction. But when you dig a little deeper, you find out they only had 21 people in one classroom in the Northeast, but they're making a big generalization about that. That's the kind of thing that you need to be able to evaluate as you're writing your lit review. Significance. As we said, the significant level that we're looking for is a 0.05. The p has to be less than 0.05. And as I've said before, significance is like pregnancy. There is no almost. Either it is or it isn't. There is something that your book refers to called approaching significance or practical significance. It's okay to discuss that in the context of limitation, the limitation being that we think that the results of a study have practical significance. The only thing that needs to happen from that point forward is that experiment needs to be conducted again, because we don't know for sure that the results that we're seeing are really because of the experiment that we conducted. It's got to be at the significance level. You need to assume also that every study is flawed. There's going to be something wrong with every study you come across, because when you study people, you can always find something wrong with them. There are so many external variables that we cannot control for that there's going to be something you could find wrong with it, but you do the best you can. The other thing is we're not out to prove anything in empirical research. Proofs are for whiskey and geometry, not research. We are gathering evidence to support or refute a hypothesis. It never and should never say that it proves anything, because as soon as you say that that one variable proves an effect on another, there will be one person who will raise their hand and say, yeah, but I saw this situation where that didn't work. Well, that's because 5 times out of 100 we're willing to accept that we've made a mistake. There's an example of somebody. So that kind of covers quantitative research, and we'll post a discussion thread based upon an article that you're going to look at.